Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's episode.
Another conversation with our dear friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis, who's now in a cabin in the Green Mountains of Vermont, sequestered through the pandemic, working on yet another book on the early national period of American history. This conversation was one that he suggested. We have been calling him, and now he's sort of become addicted to it, and our listeners love it. And here's our announcement. He has agreed to come back to the program in a week or two for the great debate. When I was at Vanderbilt University at the beginning of my academic life, the orientation included something called the raft debate, in which a literature professor and an engineer and a physicist and a philosopher each had their turn to say why, if they were on a raft and only one of them could be kept alive, which one deserved to be kept alive to help them get through the ordeal. And so each of them made the case. The engineer said he would be able to build a better boat, or perhaps devise a motor, or solar panels, or distill water. And the English major said, well, at least we can read, Cervantes, Don Quixote, or I'll teach you all about Chaucer. And they went down the line, and the philosopher came last. And at Vanderbilt, at least, the philosopher won by public acclaim. 1,000 students in a lecture hall in the raft debate. And so we're going to have the Founding Fathers raft debate, and that is, which of them was the indispensable man? There's a famous biography of Washington that said that he was the indispensable man. I asked Joe Ellis this at the end of today's program, and he agreed to come back and have a knockdown, drag-out debate about who that person was.
We should say that it'll be several weeks before that happens, because we've been stockpiling a lot of shows. We have some real special ones coming up. One with David Nicandri, which I know listeners will enjoy, about his new book. And then also one with Lindsay Chervinsky about her new book, The Cabinet. So we've been busy in this pandemic.
It's been great, and Joe Ellis has just become such a dear friend to both of us. He calls you out of the blue just to talk. And you guys
he's afraid to bother you.
Oh, well,
you sort of put that off.
I got nothing going on. He can call me anytime. But anyway, today we talk about a range of things. His father's service in World War II, after which, says Joseph Ellis, he was never wholly the same. And really haunting in his discussion today about how they've had to expand the cemetery at Arlington because of the war dead that are coming in now. From Iraq and from Afghanistan. But then we got on to His Excellency, his book on George Washington, and talked about his extraordinary capacity as a prose stylist. He's not just a historian, but he's an eminently readable historian.
Yeah.
A couple of things. One is we need to talk about
the guitar.
Kevin Miterman and the great guitar auction. So our friend Kevin Miterman up at near Grand Forks, North Dakota, a village called Thompson, is a guitar artist. He's a maker of musical instruments.
A luthier.
And he has produced some really remarkable guitars that he has put into the hands of some of the best guitarists in the world. And he has made a guitar out of heritage lumber from the Red River Valley, one piece from a barn and another piece of actual redwood from a bridge that spanned the Red River of the North. And he produced that guitar over 6 months for the Thomas Jefferson Hour. He's gifting it to the program, and we're going to auction it in a silent auction this summer and early fall. So go to the website, jeffersonhour.com, and you'll see a video that he's providing and stills of the making of this guitar, and also his own discussion of why he did it and what its purpose is. It's going to be an amazing thing. And I was so interested in your conversation a couple of weeks ago with him about that project.
That episode will broadcast where we actually have a discussion with Kevin in the coming weeks, and we'll get information on the website and his video up as soon as we can. But it's a real deal, and it's happening.
And the good news is the Thomas Jefferson Lewis and Clark tour is on. A couple of people, for medical reasons, have had to withdraw, but we had a waiting list, so we'll be gathering in Great Falls and Fort Benton, Montana at the third week of July, and we will be getting onto the White Cliffs section of the Missouri River and then hiking up in the Bitterroot Mountains. We're doing it. It's a go. And then the 2 winter encampments at Locksaw Lodge west of Missoula, one on Whitman and Thoreau, and the other on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the making of the atomic bomb, and then the decision to use the atomic bomb. They're on for mid-January 2021. And it's time to sign up for the great Monterey John Steinbeck tour, our third version of this. This time we're going to go to Bakersfield and to the Weed Patch Camp that was so central a player in the Grapes of Wrath. So all of these cultural tours are back on the map. We presume that the country will be fully open by the time we do all of this, and the first of them, now fully booked, is the Lewis and Clark Cultural Tour in Montana and Idaho for the end of July and the first days of August of this year.
I know that's what you call your favorite time of the year, one of the things you look forward to. Let's hope it all goes off without a hitch.
It's fantastic. I know you're going to agree with me 100% that we've attracted a lot of friends on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, friends who are listeners around the country, some of whom have come to visit, and we've been able to interview some of the really extraordinary historians. You remember our interviews with Ann Lucas about the discovery of Jefferson books at Washington University in St. Louis.
Yes.
We've had just Pat Brodowski as a frequent guest on this program, etc.
We need to check in with her, see how she's doing.
But our friendship, I'm going to call it that, with Joseph Ellis is one of the great things of my life. And to think that someone of his eminence is a joyful participant in our conversations is about as great a measure of the importance of Thomas Jefferson and I think the Thomas Jefferson Hour as I could possibly imagine.
Well, I think we need to call this to a halt, sir. You've got some tomatoes to plant.
You and I are going to make a rare drive-by visit. I'm on my way at this moment for you to hand a box of tomatoes, and then I will plant them before this Memorial Day
I
is
actually
over.
have 2 boxes, and we shall exchange them using proper distance protocol. They're heirlooms that I grew, and I'm happy to give them to you.
I'll see you in 15 minutes.
Very good, sir. And with that, let's go to this week's Memorial Day episode with Joseph Ellis. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about all things Jefferson. And we are so pleased this week to have our returning champion and good friend of the Thomas Jefferson Hour join us, Mr. Joseph Ellis. Clay, would you like to give him a proper introduction?
Well, Joseph Ellis is the author of a number of books, extraordinary books. He's won all of the writing prizes. He's a distinguished emeritus professor. He's now holed up at an undisclosed location somewhere in the Green Mountains of Vermont. He's been on this program a number of times during this pandemic. That's one of the great benefits of this national sequestration to us, David. We've had the chance to engage in a series of spirited conversations with Professor Ellis, and I can tell you, Joe, that we're getting a tremendous amount of feedback of people saying, more Ellis, more Ellis, more Ellis.
Oh, really? Good. Good. I mean, some of the times when we get into serious arguments with modern-day contemporary implications, Clay, I think, oh, God, we just alienated half the audience. And,
it's all interesting. We all love it. So
all right.
This is being recorded on Memorial Day, so I know you have some thoughts about your own father and Memorial Day.
Yeah, my father was a vet of World War II, and he's buried in Arlington Cemetery. And normally, I would try to get down there on Memorial Day, but Arlington Cemetery is closed. He's located in a section of the cemetery. My mother is buried right beside him, actually on top of him, and he died young when he was 49. And if you look out from where he's buried, there's a whole new extension of Arlington Cemetery, vast extension, where the bodies of about 3,000 or 4,000 American soldiers who died in the Iraq and Iran war are buried. It's a reminder of the sacrifice that those men made. But my father was in, I forget whether it's the 82nd or 101st Airborne. He was in training in London for the invasion of Europe at Normandy, and he sprained or broke both his ankles. Again, my mother tells the story, or used to tell it differently, and she said it was the greatest thing that could have possibly happened because he wasn't going to have to be dropped behind the lines, and got a 50% casualty rate on those people. And he ended up in a unit. They assigned him to a unit because he was overeducated for his position as a private. And it was an intelligence unit that followed the Army into Europe and into Germany with the task of gathering information about the Holocaust. They knew about the Holocaust, but they didn't know how bad it was. And their job, they thought, was to get there before the Russians got there and get the evidence to just bring it down. I mean, he was never the same, and he wouldn't talk about it. At any rate, that group of veterans are dying now. I was struck by the fact that the pandemic is like thinning the herd, and they're among the most vulnerable people, and that the last of them are going right now, and we shall not see their likes again. I always say that the founding generation is the greatest generation, and I think that's true in terms of the political creativity of that generation among the most prominent members. But as a kind of broad social expression of generation, that generation that came of age and served in World War II, again, we will not see their likes again.
I can hear the emotion in your voice, Joe, and you make an annual pilgrimage on or around Memorial Day to Arlington.
Right. I told my youngest son lives in D.C., and I told him to go over, and he said, "Dad, you can't get in. It's closed." At any rate, my father went on to have a successful career in the Secret Service, and he was in charge of the detail to protect the president. But again, the war changed him, and that generation internalized the experience, but didn't feel that they could talk about it. To whatever extent the final thoughts of some of these people can be captured on tape or video or whatever, or we better do it quick.
You know, we talk of the greatest generation. Those people, men mostly, but men and women came back from the war. On the whole, the received wisdom is that they didn't really want to talk about it much. They reintegrated as quickly as possible into their lives, and were pretty reluctant to discuss these things even with their children and grandchildren who asked. And of course, Tom Brokaw gave us the phrase "the greatest generation." That could be disputed, but it certainly was among the greatest generations in American history. A friend of mine from West Monroe, Louisiana, last night said to me, "You can see the response to the coronavirus visually now on the streets, that there are two Americas. There are the people who are wearing masks and are practicing social distance and are clearly hearkening to the recommendations of the medical authorities and the government of the United States. And then there are the people who are sneering at that very idea and refusing to engage in those things, protesting." And she said, "How did it happen that we don't all rise on the basis of hard science and a worldwide pandemic? How is it that there's not a unification of the American spirit of the kind we saw, say, in World War II?" You're a historian. Can you in any way clarify this?
Well, it's a question that I've thought about, and I sent you something I've written recently that's, I think, going to come out soon in the LA Times. And I put it in a way that for the Jefferson Hour is the best possible way to put it. The question that I would turn it back to you in some sense, Clay, because you're a Jeffersonian who has written a book in which you are making the case that Jefferson is quite relevant to our own world, and following Jeffersonian values is the way to go in the future in a way that is an ideal, a personal and social ideal that we ought to internalize. And at least on the face of it, okay, you could make the case that Jefferson believed, I think of him as if he's sitting still with us, Jefferson's a libertarian. He doesn't think much of government. He thinks the less government, the better. And the core of the American creed, the words that he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," places sovereignty in the individual and in individual rights. And government is a threat to individual rights. And here's where I'd like you to comment. I think I can make the case that Jefferson would wear a mask, like a mask that we wear for this pandemic, because especially in his twilight years, whenever asked, and he was asked quite often, what his deepest conviction was, he said self-government. And I think I know what he meant was that he got an idea from a Scottish philosopher named Francis Hutchinson called moral sense, that we all harbor inside ourselves, all people, no matter how well educated, what strata of society they come from, we harbor an obligation to others, and that obligation is particularly necessary in a crisis. And we're in a national security crisis now with the pandemic. And the government is not necessary as far as Jefferson is concerned. We don't have to have the president or the governor of our respective state tell us that we're supposed to do something, because we all carry in ourselves a built-in self-governing principle. And this is a kind of optimistic quasi-utopian ideal, I guess. And Jefferson was quasi-utopian and optimistic about human nature. I think he'd wear a mask, and I want to know whether or not you agree.
I think he would. Let me pick up several threads of your meditation there, Joe. Jefferson's a libertarian. He wants as little government as possible. In his quasi-utopian vision, he actually believes in the most profound way in self-government, that you, Joseph Ellis, govern yourself, and you, David Swensen, govern yourself, and each of our listeners governs her or his self, and we don't really need government except to deliver the mail and to maybe solve some disputes between Maryland and Virginia. That self-government rises almost into the level of Condorcet's view that humans can arrive at something like perfection of self-restraint and enlightenment. Obviously, you can hear John Adams grumbling.
Yeah, he said, "Dream on, Macduff."
But that's Jefferson's vision. And so, but remember what he said, Joe. He said, if you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect something that never has been and never can be in a state of civilization. That's where we are.
Well, when you say that's where we are the people who are not wearing masks?
They're ignorant and free so far.
Yeah, I mean, no, they're ignorant of science.
This only works in your formulation if those people realize that wearing a mask and social distancing are good science and absolutely the only real coping mechanism that we have. And if they reject that for whatever purpose, they are endangering themselves and others, and they're showing a deep, willful ignorance of the best epidemiological science we have, aren't they?
They are. Yes, I agree.
But they don't look at it that way.
But they're being told by the President of the United States that the act of not wearing a mask is an act of courage, that they're warriors on the battlefield of the pandemic, and that they are demonstrating courage in that way. See, that's a misconception of what a mask is, because the mask is not primarily something that protects the person wearing it. It protects the people around him. So the act of wearing, or the act of not wearing a mask, isn't an act of courage. It's an act of indifference. It's an act of statement that you don't really have any responsibility for anybody but yourself. And in that sense, it's worrisome to me that there are a significant number of people, though I think a minority, who think that way. I mean, I can go in two directions here. I can go my Adams direction, and you can then try to slay me. And or I'll go the Adams direction, even though I don't, in this particular thing, I think Jefferson would have worn a mask.
I do too.
I could say, look, I'm Adams, and I've got a crystal ball, and I'm saying, Thomas, the French Revolution is going to happen, and all the values you regard as inherent in human nature are going to be exposed as illusions.
I do think there is something that Jefferson and Adams would agree on, and that is that they want all citizens to be safe. And with that, gentlemen, we need to take just a short break. When we come back, we've received a number of emails here at the Jefferson Hour with your name in them, Mr. Ellis, and I'd like to share a couple with you, if I might.
All right.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Our dear friend Joseph Ellis is in Vermont. He's agreed to come on the program today. We began by talking about his father and World War II and Memorial Day at Arlington National Cemetery, now swollen with the fallen from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But let me just say to your point, Joe Ellis, Jefferson would not only have a mask, but he would design that mask, and that mask would have some really extraordinary gimmicks and gimcracks and qualities and quirks about it. It would be the best mask ever designed. He would then win the Paris Agricultural Prize for best mask of the pandemic. He would then offer to give it to the world without patenting it because he believes that ideas should spread freely across the world. Jefferson. He's a Renaissance man and a tinkerer. And he wouldn't just accept a mask that was approved by the CDC. He would have to design his own. But he would understand that enlightenment means that you have to see beyond the boundaries of your own narcissism and beyond the boundaries of your own self-interest. He believed in enlightened, long-term self-interest, which meant little sacrifices of one's private behavior, including at times one's private liberty, to enable us to live together under social circumstances. And he believed, as you say, along with the Scottish Enlightenment, that humans were implanted by the designer with a moral compass that told us really what to do on every occasion. And so here's my question. I know David has some emails that in your praise that we want to read.
Well, I didn't say in
question.
his praise, but we'll see.
How did Thomas Jefferson get appropriated by the people holding the guns in the gallery at the Michigan State Capitol? How did Jefferson get appropriated? I was at a protest here in Bismarck a month or so ago, and people were quoting Franklin, the old canard, those who would trade liberty for a little security don't deserve either. How did it happen that the stream of rebelliousness in the American character has appropriated Jefferson and Franklin to justify what we would regard as simply antisocial and irrational behavior?
Wow. I think that it's a failure of education in America, the kind of books that they normally would have read and the kind of arguments that they would have encountered to make them aware of what their responsibilities, their civic responsibilities are. I'm not sure. And I think the left is just as guilty as the right on this, especially the politically correct left. But I think that the anti-government ethos is associated with the right here, with the extreme right. And that's the group that is being encouraged by the president and Fox News and the more extreme right-wing media. The sad thing about it is a lot of these people are not knowing it, but they're going to be killing themselves, or they're going to be killing people in their family. And I don't know how many people we're talking about here either. I think they're a minority. I think that most of the families gathering around to talk about whether they're going to let their kids go to college, whether they're going to be going to church, they're saying no. It's going to be very difficult to open this economy up until the people feel safe, and they don't feel safe.
Just one last piece about that, and then to our listener mail, the anti-vaccine crowd is also appropriating Jefferson and other members of the founding generation. And there was a really haunting article in the New York Times recently that said, so we get a vaccine, what if half the country refuses to take it? We know this much about Jefferson. We don't know about his mask, but we do know that he was a wonderful advocate for the true smallpox vaccine. He wrote that tremendous fan letter to Edward Jenner. He had all of his family, as he liked to call it, inoculated and later vaccinated. He sent some of the vaccine with Meriwether Lewis up the Missouri River in 1804. Jefferson knew something about pandemics and diseases that kill off large sections of population, and he would be 100% for the work of the World Health Organization and the CDC and would want to get to a vaccine as quickly as possible, and he would regard anyone that would refuse that vaccine as spending their liberty in a really wrong-headed way.
You're right. There's a little anecdote in the middle of that story, and that is that George Washington was in Philadelphia in the early summer of 76. Jefferson was there too, obviously, and Martha came to stay with Washington, and Jefferson persuaded Washington that Martha should be inoculated. She could have it done in his apartment on the second floor of Market Street. And so she got inoculated there. He vacated for her, and then she quarantined there for a week. And the biggest decision strategically that Washington made as commander of the Continental Army was to insist from the very beginning of the war that anyone coming into the Continental Army had to be inoculated and then put in quarantine for 2 weeks before they could come on active duty. Washington himself had caught the smallpox, and the only time he left America, and he went to Barbados with his brother when he was a young guy and carried the pockmarks, but he understood disease. And 2/3 of the casualties on both sides in the American Revolution were a result of smallpox or measles disease. And Jefferson's famous statement about, the generations of the future need to not be held hostage to the knowledge of his time, that he saw science especially something that would continually expand our horizons and our understanding, as of course it has. And so to reject it at this very, very important moment in our history is almost, anti-Jeffersonian. It really is.
David Swensen.
There have been a number of emails that have come in the past few weeks remarking on this extraordinary four discussions that the two of you had about the Adams-Jefferson letters. And I thought I should share a couple with you, Joe, that you might enjoy. One came from Kevin Winterholt. He says he's been listening to the show for about a half a dozen years. He was an undergraduate at the University of Saskatchewan. He is now a PhD student in history at the University of Colorado in Boulder. That's your old alma mater, isn't it, Clay?
I did. I taught Latin and studied Greek at the University of Colorado at Boulder.
He's got so many alma maters. Every place in America and in England, he's been an alma mater.
Anyway, he says, the revolution is intellectually fascinating. Adams and Jefferson are titans, and listening to Professor Ellis and Clay has been a pleasure. Their discussions have prompted me to order Dr. Ellis's books, along with a copy of the correspondence. With my semester wrapping up in the next couple of days, I now know how I will spend at least part of my summer. Keep up the great work and stay safe. So there you go, sir.
Hey, Joe, he ordered all of your books. He now has to declare bankruptcy. Every time you're on the show, we bring up some subject and you say, oh, yeah, I have a book about that.
Someone said they purchased a book or many of my books. I would say, you're making a contribution to the Ellis Trust Fund to pay for my last kid to go to college. But the last kid is through college. I can't say that now. But I appreciate that. And to the extent that there's some other comments that are a bit more critical, I welcome those, because the center of my work over time, and the last thing I've written is a book called American Dialogue, The Founders and Us. It's a central theme there, that the founding didn't leave us with a truth that to know and to keep in mind. It left us with an argument about what the truth is. Jefferson wrote the American Creed, where the truth is most forcefully and indeed lyrically expressed, the one that begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident. But what those words mean and what they mean for us now, when all men are created equal, does that mean blacks? Does that mean women? Does that mean gays? Those are the ongoing arguments that we need to have. And an argument is the highest form of conversation, which is what Adams always thought too. And that's the reason I love him. But don't hesitate, David, to tell me some people are not so happy.
You don't know me well enough, because I would. In fact, I will. But first, a couple here. One from Thad Keel, who writes and says, I don't have a question, but I write simply to thank you for this podcast. I just discovered it during this pandemic, and I'm thrilled to have done so. I just listened to part 3 of the Adams-Jefferson letters and can't express how enriching this discussion was, like literally all of them have been. Somehow you, Clay, and Dr. Ellis captured the essence of Adams and Jefferson in just a few minutes. Keep it up. I remain yours most sincerely and faithfully, from Kentucky, Thad Keel. And we have another one from Steve Viharin, and this one actually is addressed to President Jefferson, but it's a great question, and I'm anxious to hear the two of you answer this. He asks, what can you tell us about your last meeting, Mr. Jefferson, with John Adams? We know that your friendship changed, and I believe I hear the Adams dog speaking. We know that your friendship changed, and it began a rivalry between the two of you. I would like to hear both of you answer that question on behalf of President Jefferson, if you would.
Well, let me start, and then Joe can add details. And I want to get back to a little Jefferson Adams debate here in a short time. But to start with this very good question, so Jefferson, the election system didn't work in his time the way it works in ours. So there wasn't the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November when we decide and we know right then who's the next president. It was a much more informal process. Each state had a different system. The electoral votes were tallied in December. But then the House of Representatives had to certify them, and the election was contested. And so it dragged on and on and on to the point that Jefferson was hardly even able to assemble a cabinet and personal secretaries before he took office on March 4th, 1801. So keep that in mind, that there was no transition period of the kind that we routinely have today. And we know that Adams skulked, may I say, Joe, out of town on the 4th of March, 1801, on the dawn stage, because he didn't want to stay to see what followed the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. And before that, they'd had a couple of meetings, and one of them was the meeting where Jefferson comes to see Adams as president in the White House, and Adams says, "You have put me out." And Jefferson then says, in his usual Jeffersonian way, "My friend, this contest must not be allowed to derail a friendship which has existed between us for a long time." He said, "If you and I died in our sleep tonight, by this time tomorrow, two others would have been pushed forward to represent the few and the many, and therefore, sir," and so on. You know that story, Joe.
I do, but you're telling it well, and I had forgotten it until you started telling it. I thought I was going to say that certainly it's right. Jefferson's inauguration, Adams is the only sitting president who's replaced and who refuses to attend the inauguration of his successor. I'll bet whatever money I make on the sale of my books from this program, that if Donald Trump loses the election to Joe Biden, that Trump won't come to the inauguration. And but
that would be the first time that's happened since, isn't it?
Since Adams. See,
well, we'll watch for that.
There wasn't a precedent. Adams didn't know he was. Adams was his grousely self, to be sure. But the real truth is, at the time, he wanted to get to New York, where his son was dying. And he didn't make it. His son died before he got there, and his son was dying of alcoholism and drug addiction.
I think that's a really important point that a lot of people miss, and I'm glad you brought it up.
They don't know that. Yeah. And so I was going to say the last person he talked to was Abigail. Because
they had tea.
When Abigail's in the White House, well, they call it the White House, in the presidential mansion, and this. Remember, the election of 1800 was a tie between Burr and Jefferson. Now, everybody intended Jefferson to win, but you voted for two people. It wasn't two separate ballots, and they tied. And Abigail became Jefferson's escort when this cocktail party, where all the members of the House who were going to vote on Jefferson or Burr are gathered, and she's advising them, saying, "Look, you got to go talk to this person over here because you need to persuade him to vote for you." And and here's his background. And she does a kind of Dun and Bradstreet on each of the. She knows them, and Jefferson doesn't even know who they are, and so I thought it was going to be Abigail, but your memory of the real truth there, Clay, is better than mine.
Oh, I have a better one. I have an even better one, Joe. So remember, when the tie happened, the moderate Federalists and some of Jefferson's friends came to him and said, "Look, if you will just acknowledge that you're not going to destroy Hamilton's fiscal system, and that you're not going to have a wholesale cleansing of all the federal office holders, and that you're going to pursue a constitutional and moderate path as president, this controversy will be over." And Jefferson claims, we don't have to believe him necessarily, that he would never do that he would not capitulate or make a compromise or enter into any conditional relationship about this. But he does go to see John Adams, and he says to Adams, look, if you will just declare that the election is over, that I was clearly elected president, that this is really a technical issue of the Constitution, and nobody expected Burr to be president. If you will just make that clear, John Adams, this thing will go away. And Adams said, ain't going to do that. You got yourself into this mess. I'm not helping. The thing will have to play itself out.
That's right. Actually, I do remember that, and that's true. I mean, mixed in that conversation is the hostility that Jefferson felt towards Adams's decision to make federal appointments to the court.
The midnight appointments.
The midnight appointments after the election. And Adams said, look, I had to make them. And of course, the big one is John Marshall to be Supreme Court Justice, who's going to become a permanent albatross around Jefferson's neck throughout his presidency. And Jefferson really resented that. Now, Abigail apologized. I mean, Abigail, criticized Jefferson for even thinking that way, saying that he had to appoint him. He was supposed to appoint him. And we get into these days now when McConnell deferred an appointment of a Supreme Court judge for 9 months. That is, it was 9 months before the next president took office. But I think that Jefferson's refusal to support Adams's refusal to support Jefferson was him saying that I should not get involved. Meanwhile, what's going on in the background at the same time is Alexander Hamilton is lobbying for Jefferson against Burr.
The lesser of two evils.
And the lesser of two evils is right. Well, like he said, we know Jefferson's principles are all wrong, but Burr doesn't have any principles at all. And this is the real beginning of what will become the duel. This is the duel between, that's what Burr really resented, and for understandable reasons, and led them to their so-called appointment in Weehawken 4 years later. But anyway, lots going on in that one little moment.
I have one more, and then we're going to take a short break, and when we come back from that break, I have one that takes both of you gentlemen to task, so you can look forward to that. But Chris Byerly writes and says, "Good day, sirs. I am thoroughly enjoying your recent shows with Joseph Ellis. Thank you for serving up this to us in these challenging times. It brings joy to so many, as demonstrated on the Thomas Jefferson Hour Facebook group." He says, "I've been reading American Sphinx and now hear the pithy and often humorous voice of Joseph Ellis on each page. So much fun. The quarantine has created so many Jeffersonian opportunities for introspection and self-improvement. Many thanks, Chris Byerly." So how about that?
I like that, of course.
Of course. We'll leave you, sir, on that happy note and take a short break. When we come back, I have more questions for you. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're talking to our dear friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis, now quarantined somewhere in the Green Mountains of Vermont at an undisclosed location. You heard his dogs in the background there. We wouldn't be happy if they didn't.
Labradoodles back here, Clay.
They're obviously Adamsites, and whenever Jefferson gets too much airtime on this program.
No, they're Southerners. Actually, one of them's from Australia.
We had this letter, Joe, that said that they really love your writing and particularly the wit and humor in American Sphinx. And that's how I first became fascinated by you, because you and I met under the auspices of Ken Burns, and we were both talking heads on Ken Burns' documentary on Thomas Jefferson.
We gave Ken a hard time too.
We got in trouble. We were put on double secret probation for being too irreverent.
The reason you love American Sphinx because it begins with a scene where you're giving a talk in Worcester.
That's not why I love it, because what you say in the talk is, if this guy's authentic, Jefferson's got some real problems. I've got to try to figure this out in this volume. So it's kind of a backhanded compliment. But I'll tell you this, what I love about American Sphinx is that that since, let's say 1995, the pendulum has swung really into an anti-Jeffersonian direction until there are really some bad books that just condemn him out of hand for this and that and so on. It's really been, I think, a deplorable waste of historiography to savage Jefferson just because it's possible. But here's what's so good about American Sphinx. It was clear to me when I read it that you find Jefferson perplexing, but you also find him amusing because he had this way to wall off different parts of his consciousness and they didn't really talk to each other. And there's a part of him that's sort of delightfully out of touch with reality, and that it's fun to, you were playful about that. You acknowledged the problems of Jefferson, but you didn't attack him. You just said, look at what a fascinating and unusual human being this was.
Well, I think that historians that have done the kind of demonization and that you described are too plentiful. I mean, it's because the race issue, and once you look through the race window exclusively, you're going to always have some hostile things to say about Jefferson. But there's a line that some historian, I think a British historian named Collingwood used. He said, historians should not be or can regard themselves as judges, much less hanging judges. I mean, our job is to recover the past on its own terms. And in Jefferson's case, I think that that there's all kinds of extraordinary insights that he has, that he's far ahead of his time and is worthy of our admiration. There are others that doesn't work that way, but that our job isn't to sort of judge him against our own politically correct standards, but to attempt to understand why he saw the world the way he did.
You know, people have been listening to you, and they obviously are so enjoying your wisdom, your humor, your lightheartedness, but also your passion for American history and your insights. But it's easy to forget what a great prose stylist you are. So I want to read, David, to both of you, this passage from His Excellency. This is about after the war, when Washington is retiring and going back like Cincinnatus to Mount Vernon, and his self-awareness that he's not quite what he once was. Just listen to this. This is page 149 of His Excellency. There was also one new ingredient in the heroic chemistry, Washington's growing recognition that just as his place in the heavens was assured, his time on earth was running out. During the war, he was too preoccupied with the daily duties of command to notice that he had moved past the allotted time, 50 years, that male members in the Washington line seldom reached, and that he himself referred to as the meridian of life. As he observed the officers at Newburgh, his hair had in fact grown gray in the service of his country. Those huge eye sockets were now permanently creased. The impressive muscularity of his torso had begun to soften and sag. The massive bone structure that had carried him with such grace on horseback or on the dance floor was now afflicted with rheumatism. The man who had once led the pack in fox hunts now often declined the invitation to join the hunt rather than to bring up the rear. A somber note of resignation began to appear in his correspondence, the poignant tone of a once great athlete past his prime who felt literally in his bones that he was, quote, gliding down the stream of life. Joe, that's just outstanding English prose, among other things.
You know, I work really hard on the writing of a book. Now, if you're not interested in trying to express yourself in ways that are engaging, see paradox and irony, and anyway, I work really hard to make it look like it's easy. The best storytellers, a lot of them are British historians.
We're talking about the Washington book. Yeah, there's rumors of maybe it turning into a film script?
Yeah, it is. Somebody's writing the script for a miniseries of the book His Excellency that would go on something like Netflix, I think. And the guy called me from Culver City, say, "Oh, we're doing our pitch." I said, "Well, what's a pitch?" I thought that's what a professional baseball player did rather than a producer of a film. But that's apparently a very important technical term. I'll believe it when I see it. These things often don't happen. But one of the things for listeners to think about that I'm thinking about, and if you got an idea, send it to me. I have a website, Joseph Ellis Historian, and if you wanted to cast Washington in a miniseries, what actor would you choose? I have some thoughts, but I won't undermine you. But that's a legitimate question.
So, Joe, if this book gets optioned and you get $1 million, I hope you'll give 100,000 to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. You're going to be a very rich man.
I tell you what, if I get $1 million, I will give you 100,000.
You heard it here, folks.
There it is. I'm not going to get $1 million. I'll probably get nothing. But nevertheless, if it happens and I get $1 million, I will give $100,000 to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hear, hear.
There it is. Two of you hear that. All the listeners can hear that. Okay, if I fail in this, that you can call me on it.
Would you give me 10 grand just to edit that bit out?
If it comes to that, obviously, yes.
On to this letter. It comes from Doug Reed, and he asks, are you judging Cuomo by his televised performance or by his actions and results? The praise that the two of you gave to Governor Cuomo was just too much, and he has a number of points. So today's paper says that New York State has had over 4,800 virus deaths in nursing homes. This is about a third of the virus deaths in the state. It was Governor Cuomo that ordered virus-stricken patients back to the nursing homes, which generally lacked adequate protection for both residents and staff. And there's more on his list. Do you want to respond to that one?
The thing that I found winning about Cuomo is he admits he made mistakes. And the one cited by the writer is one of them he admits. He admits he was late to the game. He should have seen this coming more earlier than he did, and that cost lives. He owned up to it. He thinks this pandemic is a serious problem that's still in its earliest stages of gestation and affliction of us. I think he speaks truth, and I believe that the person heading the government of the United States is not capable of doing that as well or at all. And so my praise of Cuomo is based in part on the contrast with President Trump.
So it's his performance. I mean, he goes on and he says that when Cuomo was told by his medical department in 2015 to purchase ventilators for the emergency use, he did not. When he panicked about not having enough ventilators, Trump sent them. Turns out they were not needed. When Cuomo dramatically said they would run out of beds for virus patients, Trump had the Javits Center converted into a hospital. Turns out it was not needed. When Cuomo said New York City would run out of beds for non-virus patients, Trump set the hospital ship. Turns out it was not needed. I don't think this is worth further discussion on the podcast. I'll give you both a chance to respond to that. I thought it was fair to bring this up.
Well, let me just echo what the distinguished historian Joseph Ellis said. It's not about every decision that Andrew Cuomo has made, but with Cuomo, you get the sense of a serious administrator addressing a very perplexing situation. Of course, he made mistakes. And, Theodore Roosevelt told us a leader inevitably makes mistakes, but the great leader is the one that's not afraid to act because he's frightful of the decisions that he will make. But a great leader, said Roosevelt, is also the one that freely admits when things have gone wrong and moves in a different direction. That was the basis of my defense of Andrew Cuomo. I admire him greatly for his capacity to look beyond the edge of his own ego in addressing this situation.
I have to be Doug Reed's advocate, the gentleman who sent this in, because he's not here. And I'm going to go back to his first question. Are you judging Cuomo by his televised performance or by his actions and results? I think it's a question about whether or not Cuomo is more highly rated than he should be based on performance rather than results.
Well, first of all, I disagree with the idea of the word performance. This is a governor working tirelessly to try to figure out how to get through this rationally and with a minimal loss of life. It's Cuomo saying, this responsibility rests on my shoulders. The easy decisions never come to this level. I'm going to make decisions. We don't have enough information yet. I'm going to make the decisions that I think are best for the people of New York. I know I'm going to go wrong. And as Jefferson said, but you have to understand, these are not errors of the heart. When I go wrong, these will be errors of the head.
I think that I'll end up disagreeing with the writer, but the disagreement is an honest one, and it's one that we're encouraging on the Jefferson Hour as a dialogue that's important to have, and not to be dismissive about it, but that, in my judgment, this is a catastrophe. we're living through an epidemic that's really Trump believes the epidemic is over. It's not. It's just starting. We rank 131st in the world in terms of casualties. I think that performance is something that's going to be judged by historians.
Before we run out of time for the week, I have one more question. And again, I want to go back to the beginning of the program and recognize Memorial Day and its importance. But this comes from Kevin Johannesson, and this is perfect for both of you. How much did Jefferson and John Adams' forms of local government influence their thinking when forming a national government? The Virginia-appointed local burgesses were very different than the rough and rowdy New England town meeting. What say you both?
I'll start and let Joe get the last word. Two things. One is that here's the provincialism of Jefferson. He believed he was a Virginian and that was his country. And he always said, Virginia is my country. And he saw the United States either as Virginia writ large or Virginia as far and away first among equals in the country. And that was a mistake that Jefferson made. But on the other hand, he also said later in his life, we're falling behind and New England is surging ahead. And here's why. They've solved the problem of slavery there. They have New England town meetings, which are something like actual democracy at the local level, and they're training grounds for citizenship and for leadership, and they have public education. We have none of those things here in Virginia, and that means we are going to fall behind in all of the important metrics of what an American republic can be. So it cuts both ways. I think Jefferson recognized with pride the primacy of Virginia in the American Revolution, but he also understood that Virginia had made a series of really bad choices following the Revolution, and that Virginia was headed towards being the capital of the Confederacy.
I really underline what Clay just said and concur. Virginia would have been better off if it ended slavery, better off economically, as a matter of fact. And Jefferson ended up bankrupt, as did many of the other prominent planters in Virginia. The only one that didn't end up that way was Washington, because he owned all this land out in the West. But in some ways, Jefferson's vision for the kind of great society is a community of people that know each other, that see each other every day. In some sense, that existed in New England in a way that it didn't in Virginia. The organizing principle in New England was the town, and in Virginia was the county. And Jefferson's educational system that he wanted to develop, he called the ward system, was almost as if he was talking about New England and rather than about Virginia. So it's paradoxical here, but I think that Jefferson's vision of what an American society could be derived from a notion that was a small groups of people living in communities in which they knew each other well, and it's harder to imagine it being replicated at the national level.
Jefferson's America was founded, in my opinion, in the pages of Virgil and Horace, in other words, in no man's land, whereas Adams' vision of America was founded in the sturdy, Calvinist practicality and hard-scrabbled land of New England, and so they couldn't be different. I know we're out of time, David. With your indulgence, I'm going to ask a question of Joe that he will give a 30-second answer to now, and it will be the basis of our next debate. And this is it.
Great.
You know, Joe, that the phrase indispensable man has been attached to George Washington in a biography before yours. My view is that's not true. My view is that Thomas Jefferson is the indispensable man, and here's why. If you take John Adams out of the picture, America loses something, but we essentially are the same America. If you take Monroe out of the picture, we're essentially the same America, etc. You can even take George Washington out of the picture, you'd rather not, and you get the vision of America that Jefferson created. That Jefferson is the American dream. He's the articulator of our national mission statement. He gave us the words that haunt us and that we can never quite live up to. He dreamed higher than the pragmatics and the reality of his time. And that's what America is. It's this nation that dreams of being so much better than it ever actually is. And without Jefferson, we're just a nation.
I would make the case for Washington for two reasons. Without Washington, we don't win the war. If we don't win the war, there is no republic for Jefferson's ideas to flourish in. Second, indispensable man. Yeah, but the reason that the republic succeeds is that Washington refuses to be the dictator. That's what everybody thought was going to happen. But Washington said that in a republic, no one is indispensable, including me. We are all disposable. The people is, and Jefferson would agree with this, is indispensable. But that, and Jefferson himself wrote the words right after Washington surrendered his commission and sword in Annapolis in December of 1783, saying, "We have just witnessed the greatest act in American history because we failed to make the mistake that all young republics make, and that we failed to make that mistake. We did the right thing because of one man, George Washington, who walked away from power and became the American Cincinnatus."
Well, at least we swept Adams off the table.
Gentlemen, thank you both for another fascinating conversation.
You've been listening to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with Joseph Ellis, the author of American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, and the author of Passionate Sage about John Adams. We'll see you next week for an important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.